Now, a new take on Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, with President George Washington as the touchstone. I recently talked with the author of this look at two men who helped shape American history. The Civil War split families, states, and the nation. 74 years after the signing of the Constitution, the United States was torn in two. One of the more conflicted participants in the war was none other than Robert E. Lee, a son of a Revolutionary War hero who was a trusted aide to General George Washington. He married the daughter of Washington's adopted son. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Lee had served 25 years with the U.S. Army. But in April 1861, he turned down an offer to command the Union Army, resigned his commission, and accepted the command of the military and naval forces of Virginia. All this and more can be found in the new book, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War and His Decision That Changed American History, by Jonathan Horn, who served as a speechwriter and special assistant to former President George W. Bush. Jonathan Horn, welcome to the NewsHour.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you grew up in the area around Washington. Is that where this interest in Robert E. Lee came from?
That's exactly where this interest came from. If you grow up on the Potomac River, you have so much of Robert E. Lee's and George Washington's history all around you. Robert E. Lee was born in Westmoreland County, downriver from Washington, and so was George Washington. Robert E. Lee grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, right near George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation. And Robert E. Lee married his wife at Arlington House, which is that great pillared mansion that's now a cemetery. But back then, it was actually a memorial to George Washington. It was filled with relics of George Washington because, as you mentioned, Robert E. Lee had married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son. So
describe the decision he made that you argue changed American history.
Robert E. Lee actually opposed secession. I think that's a surprise to most people today. But he was actually reading a biography of George Washington as the Union comes apart. And as he's reading this biography, he concludes that the Founding Fathers themselves would have opposed secession. But then he gets this offer. He gets called to Washington by an emissary for Abraham Lincoln, who says, "The country looks to you as the representative of the Washington family to save the Union." And Lee turns down this command because as much as he loves the Union, he can't imagine going to war against his native state of Virginia.
So, I mean, the premise then is that here's this great man who was considered a great hero for the Confederacy in the Civil War. When the moment came for a decision that would matter, he made the wrong one.
That's very much what happened. He forever cast his fate against George Washington's greatest legacy, the Union. And that's ultimately what made me want to write this story, is that tragic tension in Lee's life. How a soldier so associated with George Washington goes to war against George Washington's greatest legacy, the Union.
And he continued to be conflicted about it. You write about what he went through in the period after that.
Right, and what's amazing is after the war, he actually revises his views, and he starts saying maybe the Founding Fathers hadn't been opposed to secession, and he does try to revisit what happened. He really is tortured. There are lots of descriptions of him with very sad looks on his face, riding his horse after the war, and people wondering, what is he thinking?
You also write, Jonathan Horn, about what he thought about slavery. He wasn't comfortable with it, but he did, in the end, defended it. He kept slaves. You even tell a really remarkable story. You quote someone as describing a scene where he himself whipped a female slave who had tried to escape when one of his employees said he couldn't do it.
Right, and that's one of the most controversial moments in Robert E. Lee's life. We don't exactly know what happened there. He denied that story. But what's so interesting is what most entangled Robert E. Lee in the institution of slavery, because he really didn't want to be involved with it. He wanted to stay away from it. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking he was an abolitionist. He certainly was not. But what happens is his father-in-law, who is George Washington's adopted son, dies and leaves a will naming Robert E. Lee as executor of estates. And those estates actually include slaves who have descended from Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. So on the eve of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee is managing slaves who have direct connections to the father of our country.
You write not only about the decision that he made to join the Confederacy, but about decisions he made as a general. I mean, he has a reputation as a brilliant general. It's the reason that both the North and the South went after him. But in the end, when you look at the decisions he made as a general, was he a great general?
He was a brilliant military mind, and what's so interesting about Lee is we have this impression of him always taking the initiative in battle, even though his forces were outmanned and outgunned. But he never saw it that way. He always thought he had no choice. He had to take incredible risks because the odds against him were so stacked. And so the way we view Lee today isn't necessarily the way he viewed himself.
Was there a chance that with Lee in charge in the South could have prevailed?
Absolutely. I don't think we can say anything is inevitable. If those Union soldiers hadn't held Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg, who knows what would have happened? I think one of the lessons I took away from this book is that nothing is inevitable in history. History turns on the decisions of single individuals all the time, and we shouldn't ever make the mistake of thinking that history is inevitable.
Well, it is a fascinating book, whether you are into Civil War history or not. It's the man who would not be Washington, Robert E. Lee's Civil War, and his decision that changed American history. Jonathan Horn, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.